All right, so if you remember last week, we started the end of the epilogue. We talked a little bit about the structure of this book, and we're at the tail end now, chapters 19, 20, and 21, and we covered chapters 19 and 20 last week, and there was some really harsh material in those stories. There's a lot of brutality, a lot of cowardice, and we found that someone's personal honor was way more important than someone's life, at least to those men at those times. We talked about the call to arms as a means to enact justice for the wrong that was committed, for the sins that was committed. We talked a little bit about the battles and the losses, and then an humble appeal to God, and that resulted in a blessing of victory. But the victors took some license with that blessing, and they went a little overboard. And it wasn't just a victory, it was an actual destruction of nearly an entire tribe of Israel. The entire tribe of Benjamin was reduced down to 600 men that had escaped into the forest. And in fact, just so we can kind of recapture that tone in that moment while we cover the final chapter, I want to read you the last 3 verses of chapter 20. On that day, 25,000 Benjamite swordsmen fell, all of them valiant fighters. But 600 of them turned and fled into the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon, where they stayed 4 months. The men of Israel went back to Benjamin. Now this is where they, I believe, overextended themselves. Not overextended, but their zealousy took them off of God's blessing, and they went back to a humanistic zealousy. The men of Israel went back to Benjamin and put all the towns to the sword, including the animals and everything else they found. All the towns they came across, they set on fire. So what they were unwilling or unable to do under God's command to the Canaanites, they did to their own brothers and sisters. So it wasn't just a military battle. Once they defeated the army, they went and killed everyone they could find in the entire tribe. They wiped them out. So that brings us now to chapter 21. And let me give you just a quick summary, then we'll dive deeper into this a little bit. So after this, I'm not going to call it a victory, but after they won against the Benjamites and then wiped them out, we find that when they had gathered at Mizpah earlier, they actually committed themselves to 2 vows. And in chapter 21, we see what those vows were. One, they pledged that no one would give their daughter to marriage to a Benjamite, and that anyone who didn't show up when they were called at Mizpah was going to be killed. And those vows create a problem, and we'll talk about that later. So we find out that these vows had taken place when they had gathered before the Lord at Mizpah. They've had the battle, they wiped out Benjamin, they have gone back together, and now they're grieving that Benjamin's dead. They're missing all the people they just killed. So, as one does, they decide to commit more murder, to steal 400 women, and give them to the remaining 600 Benjamites. And well, that's not good enough. And so then they decide to legislate the kidnapping and rape of 200 more women to give to the rest of the Benjamites. And everyone lives happily ever after. Obviously, I'm being sarcastic. But this is the kind of rationalization that we're seeing when everyone does what's right in their own eyes. And this is what chapter 21 is talking about. Just very briefly, it mentions Jabesh Gilead, and there's some controversy over where that city is and what it meant and the naming. But it's think of it kind of as the capital city that was in eastern Manasseh in that tribe. It was about 15 miles east of the Jordan and was probably the commercial capital of that tribe's region. So just so you kind of have that in your mind. So let's break this chapter down just a little bit. I'm not going to refer to it specifically, but I put up a little map there that I found through some Google searching, just so you can kind of get your head around a little bit of the geography and all the different machinations through the time from when the Levite initially went to go retrieve his concubine all the way until the end of chapter 21. But we're told that in their zeal in chapter 20, when they're gathered at Mizpah, and you can kind of imagine 400,000 people, they're getting themselves riled up and they're ready to go, they're going to go get some justice, right? They're going to go get some justice. And they're all energized and excited. And they make a couple of vows that come back and really create some problems for them because they're made in a rash way and they're made in a prideful way. These vows have nothing to do with godliness or righteousness. This is humanistic. Everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes. So the first vow says that no one would give any of their daughters in marriage to Benjamin. So not only were they planning to wipe them out, they were making sure that they were going to go extinct. That's what they were trying to do with this vow. And it reminds me a little bit of Judges 11:30 when Jephthah talks about his vow, and we'll kind of wrap this up, and we'll kind of see how Jephthah's vow, while horrible, wasn't quite as bad as this one, right? So the relativism in Judges is a little bit astounding. The second vow is that they would execute anyone who didn't show up before the Lord at this convention at Mizpah. So they were going to go get some justice, but by golly, everyone had to show up. They weren't going to give anybody a pass. So the good news is they were trying to be unified. The bad news is if you didn't join the club, we're going to come get you. Okay? And so these vows also carried a curse with them. And that's really important to kind of explain some of the behavior we see later in this chapter. So that's what we're told in verses 1 through 5. They disclose these vows with a curse that had been made. With time to reflect now, the Israelites are really missing the tribe of Benjamin. And they regret their rash actions. I think it's kind of dawning on them exactly what their runaway zealousy has encouraged them to do. And remember, culturally, the number 12 almost has kind of a mystical significance. And they're suddenly realizing, hey, if we're not 12, we're not anybody. We've just lost part of our identity. Now, I would hope their identity is more wrapped up in their covenant with God, but this is more wrapped up in kind of a social structure. But anyway, it really bothers them now that they wiped out the entire tribe except for the 600 men wandering around and ran away in the forest. So in verse 3, it says, Lord God of Israel, they cried. So they're all around the campfire, and they're wailing, and they're gnashing their teeth now. They're full of woe and regret. And they say, Lord God of Israel, why has this happened to Israel? Why should one tribe be missing from Israel today? Now, I have to confess, the first few times I read this, I was kind of like, well, duh, you just killed everybody. What do you mean? Why did the Lord let this happen? And so, again, when you're reading the Bible and you get kind of one of those duh moments or something's really weird, I would encourage you to lean into that a little bit and test if your first impression's really correct. And mine wasn't. Not that they're not stupid, but it's not this one verse, right? So if you read it literally, you kind of come away with a conclusion that I've already talked about, because they were what happened to Israel. But when you dig into it a little bit more, and especially when you pair it with the verse that comes after, right? So don't read this in isolation. But the tone and the intent, it's really more a kind of a wail of regret, right? This is their outcry. This is part of how they're wearing their guilt. They're owning their guilt. And it's kind of implying a prayer to God to seek a way out of this calamity. So that's how we should really read verse 3. And I think that's supported by what happens in verse 4, where we're told that they build some more altars and they offer burnt sacrifices and peace offerings, which suggests they were kind of seeking forgiveness and seeking some help. So that's good until you read a little bit further. In the next passage, so in 7 through 14, the Israelites think of a way to use vow number 2 to get around vow number 1. So remember, vow number 1 was no one will give his daughters to Benjamin for marriage. And vow number 2 is if you didn't show up at Mizpah before if you didn't show up, if you didn't answer the call to arms, you're basically siding with Benjamin, and so now we're going to come kill you. So they used number 2, vow number 2, as a workaround to vow number 1, because they wanted now Benjamin to be able to propagate. They wanted to help the 600 men of Benjamin reestablish their tribe. And a quick side note, it's really interesting. Benjamin sort of recovers from this, but even all the way through the rest of the Old Testament, they're never a great tribe again. So, yeah, Saul comes from Benjamin and some other things, and a couple of the judges come from this tribe later on, but they never fully recover. But anyway, just a little bit of academic study points if you want to go off and explore that for yourself. So, since no one from Jabesh Gilead showed up at Mizpah, they said, hey, if you're not with us, you're against us. So we're going to come get you. But we're going to kill everybody but your virgins. Because then what we're going to do, we're going to slaughter everybody except for the virgins, and then we're going to take those virgins and give them to what's left of Benjamin so they can begin reestablishing their tribe. I mean, how nice is that, right? We're just going to kill an entire city, but we're going to go help our brothers. It's kind of hard to get my head around, to be honest. So, this implies that showing up, right, the call to arms, wasn't just one representative from each tribe. They were expecting armies from at least the main cities, the main dwellings within each tribe. We're not told why people from this city didn't show up. Maybe they disagreed. Maybe the messenger never arrived. Maybe they were just late. We're not told why, but the consequence is, we're going to kill you, except for your virgin daughters, because we have plans for them. So because Jabesh Gilead didn't show up, they broke vow number 2. The Israelites executed the consequence of not showing up and then used them as a way to help get around vow number 1, which is they couldn't give any of their daughters, but they can steal someone else's daughters who broke vow number 2 and give them to Benjamin. So it's a little convoluted. I mean, it's pretty messed up, right? It's this rationalization. It's this adherence to a vow, a rash, ungodly vow that was more important than other people's lives. It's just a strange coincidence. But what was important to them is that because Jabesh Gilead had broken vow number 2, they could steal these virgin women and give them to Benjamin, but the people who did that weren't breaking vow number 1. So if you kind of see how they're using this really self-centered rationalization, right? They're doing what's right in their own eyes because their personal honor is more important than the lives of everyone in Jabesh Gilead. So in verse 15, they say, they're wailing again because 400 is not 600. So 200 men in the tribe of Benjamin still don't have any way to help reestablish the tribe and have children. And at verse 15, they tell us that the Lord made a gap in the tribes of Israel. So again, they're trying to pin this on the Lord. The takeaway here for me is that, remember, the Benjamites were the authors of the sin, right? It started with that group of wicked men, and then the entire tribe got behind them and said, either we endorse what happened, or because we're so prideful, you can't tell us what to do. I'm going to defend this ungodly group of men. I'm going to defend with my life their right to be sinful. And that's what the tribe of Benjamin, that was the offense that Benjamin committed. So they were the authors of the sin. God was the author of the punishment, right? After a few failed attempts, God did bless the Israelites with a guarantee of victory. The Israelites executed that judgment, but they greatly exceeded their commission. God's blessing didn't say, and wipe them out. He just assured them victory. Words mean things, and we have to be really careful when we take something from the Lord and put ourselves into it too much. That's a danger sign for us. So they exceeded their commission, and they exercised a severity of judgment that was wholly inappropriate. As we continue through 15 through 18, these verses, we see the Israelites rationalize, what they choose to do in the next passage. So this is the preamble. This is verses 15 through 18 kind of give us the psychology of what's going on. It explains, doesn't justify what they do. It justifies it in their own minds, but it explains what they do. And they're choosing to violate a moral law in order not to violate some rash, ungodly oaths. So again, their own honor is more important than godliness, more important than the lives of the people in Jabesh-Gilead, legislated the basically kidnapping of the 400 virgin daughters, and is about to legislate and rationalize what happens in the next passage. And what's frustrating to me is that the answer is so simple. You know, if you're blinded by your oath, go back to God. Go back to Phineas and say, look, we have a provision in Deuteronomy that when someone makes a stupid oath, we have a way out. We can get out of it. We don't have to adhere to this, to the end-all, be-all of all things. And more importantly, this oath is not justification for committing more sin. I don't know why they didn't do that. Pride, stupidity, whatever. So I don't understand why they didn't go back to God and ask for that forgiveness. I don't know why the Levites, I don't know why Phineas didn't understand that. I don't know why he wasn't leading Israel in a different way. I think it's hubris. Their personal honor was given a higher status than their morality and their righteousness. We have to be careful sometimes when we put a cause before righteousness. And let me strengthen that again. We should never put a cause before righteousness. Well, I've got a lot more to say on that, but I'm just going to stop there. So verses 19 through 24. So to circumvent giving, right, so Benjamin had 400 wives, and they needed more because it was 600 men. And I'm not getting too caught up. Was it 599? Was it 720? You know, the Bible says 600. I'm happy to take that literally. I'm happy to take that as an approximation. The key is to remember is it was a small remnant of Benjamin. And the Israelites were determined now in their guilt to go help fill in the gap that the Lord made. And we've already talked about how that's a misappropriation. But so to circumvent giving their daughters, right, they still were unwilling to break vow number 1. The remaining 200 Benjamites are instructed to take 200 virgins from the festival at Shiloh. Now, we're not told which festival it is. We could kind of dive off into which one was maybe happening and what time of year it was. Maybe it was the Feast of the Tabernacles or whatever, but the cultural point is this was one of the few times where women were going to be allowed out in public to dance. Now, they would be separated, right? They weren't dancing with other men, but it was kind of an ideal situation. They're kind of like, hey, we're having a party, and all these unmarried women are going to be in a group. So the 200 of you that don't have wives, now's your chance. Go grab you one. And I mean that literally. That's kind of the exchange that took place. And you ask yourself, whoa, how can you justify kidnapping and rape of 400 women to make them now your wife? Well, you can't. I think maybe they were twisting a little bit of something we find in Deuteronomy 22, and verses 28 and 29 say, suppose a man comes across a virgin who is not engaged and overpowers and rapes her, and they are discovered. The man who has raped her must pay her father 50 shekels of silver, and she must become his wife because he has violated her. He may never divorce her as long as he lives. Privately, I think that verse in Deuteronomy is meant to make sure to minimize that. It wasn't to encourage it. And my opinion, the Israelites maybe took what they wanted out of that and said, oh yeah, well, you know, we've kind of got a way around this, so let's just go in. Let's lean into this and get these other 200 wives for the tribe of Benjamin. So they were technically keeping their oath. Legalistically, they were adhering to the words of the oath. But I don't have to tell you where their hearts were, right? They were actually evading the intent of the oath with fraud, violence, authorized kidnapping, rape. What's really interesting is later in the chapter they say, oh, and the fathers of these brides, when they get outraged, as they will, just tell them, thanks for helping out. It's for the greater good. Thanks, buddy. I know how I would feel about that. So the Israelites, they were using this adherence to this rash, ungodly oath as a way to justify more sin, right? And that's a warning for us. I can't think of a case where more sin is justified to cover up sin, right? We should have a broken and contrite heart. We should be pleading for forgiveness through repentance and making amends. So anyway, the Israelites were using this rationalization, this justification of, oh, I'm keeping my oath as a way to commit even more horrible and escalating sins. And we see that in America today. Adherence to a humanistic ideology in certain political platforms is becoming some people's God. And it's adherence to certain aspects of those political platforms that is driving, quite frankly, sinful and ungodly behavior. And it's being promoted as righteousness. Judges is happening today. This is not just a story from thousands of years ago. We are still doing what's right in our own eyes. Judges is a warning about what those results are, and we're seeing some of that in our society today. So, if you're... Yeah, Chris, you had a question?
I wanted to add on to your comment. Can you hear me?
I can. Mm-hmm.
I want to add on to your excellent comment about the parallel with what's happening today, and just kind of review what happened with Israel. They departed from absolute truth, God's word, and decided to do what's right in their own eyes. Once they do that, they end up with moral relativity. And once you do that, it's a slippery slope that you can justify anything, because the means justifies the ends. And as you look at what they did, it's the same thing that's happening now. Go back to the beginning. They ignored or choose not to believe absolute truth from God and started making up their own agenda. And it's just one idiocy built upon top of another. And after a while, you get back, how in the world did we get here? As I'm reading this text like you were, I go, what were they thinking? Well, I think that's the process that happens and is still unfolding today. So thank you for
I agree.
pointing that out, and not just today, but in the whole series. Excellent.
Thank you, brother. For those of you online, greetings, by the way. And if you couldn't hear the comment, our brother Chris was kind of echoing that sentiment that moral relativism is what's being highlighted here in Judges. And what he meant by that is just, when God is not your God, humanistic ideals, moral relativism becomes your guide. And Judges is showing us what happened and what is happening when you allow that to be the case. Hence, the title for the series is God with a capital G. Is God my God? And in Israel, these stories are showing us that no, other things were their God. So if you read through Judges, and and I made this mistake a few times, trying to read through the Bible in a year. Oh, I forgot to read today. Oh, Judges. I'm going to read a few chapters to catch up. It's pretty tempting to kind of read this through and not really pick out some of these meaty points. And it's kind of, you may feel like these chapters are a little bit less brutal than 19 and 20. Maybe a little bit of kidnapping, maybe a little bit of legislated rape. Maybe that's not so bad. Heck, that poor concubine was abused all night long and cut up into 12 pieces. I mean, that's the worst thing, right? Well, let me challenge that perception, and let's think about this kind of in a continuum. So this final story of Judges here in chapter 21, it's basically the predetermined and endorsed kidnapping and rape of 600 women who were then forcibly kept as wives because they had been raped as virgins. And that was done in the name of an oath. And that oath was made in the name of someone's honor. That's pretty horrible. I don't care what culture you live in. That's just horrible. So don't miss the significance of this context, right? This final episode began in chapter 19. And when I introduced this final part of the epilogue, if you remember, I talked about how this is a treatise on cause and effect. So go back to chapter 19. Some worthless men in Gibeah took this Levite's concubine, gang raped her and abused her all night, resulted in her death. That rape and murder was accentuated by her being cut into 12 pieces and sent as a message and a call to arms for justice, because that crime had so incensed the rest of the Israelites. And so in response to this rape and murder, they take these vows to go to war with their Benjamite brethren, coming very close to completely driving them to extinction. So one rape and murder now justifies a military defeat of 25,000 men and the murder and burning of all of their cities. So they went to this war, and now those who were so enraged by this rape are doing what? The same thing. And somehow they've contrived a moral compass that all of this is okay. They were so offended by the rape of the concubine, they decided to conspire to bring about the rape of 600 more women, because that's justice? Yeah, I'm not there. I'm not there at all. In fact, where I'm at is I'm grieving at the desperate, hypocritical nature of what the Israelites have done and kind of how this rationalization has worked. They're enraged by the prospect of these rapes, but then authorized it 600 more times. And, remember the idolatry in chapter 17 and 18, Micah's high place and Micah's false religion, that should have enraged them. And that was met with a yawn. Oh, yeah, we can take God out of schools. Oh, yeah, we can take In God We Trust off the dollar. And let's change the Pledge of Allegiance. Let's redefine marriage. Heck, let's just redefine what a man and a woman even is. Ooh, don't you talk to me about Christ, because you're closed-minded. Oh, wait, sorry. Were we in Judges or are we today? Sometimes I get them confused. This kind of thinking happens when God with a capital G, when Yahweh is not my God. When Yahweh is not your God. When Yahweh is not our God. So verse 25 sums it all up. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. It's a conclusion after this pretty brutal journey we've been on. When I first finished this outline of Judges, mentally I was kind of like, whoa, man, that's a journey. It's also the end of this chapter. It's the end of this story of reclaiming wife for Benjamin. It's the end of the epilogue, and in fact, it's the end of the entire book of Judges. It's a warning. It's an explanation. It's a treatise on what I call bottom-up righteousness. If everyone is defining God themselves instead of letting God define himself, you get this kind of thinking, you get these kinds of results. And today we have lots of different labels, but it's still here. It's still here. Here's what I want to leave you with for chapter 21. Society does not define righteousness. Michael's Bible study does not define righteousness. Some crazy tweet does not define righteousness. Federal law does not define righteousness. Whoever serving as president does not define righteousness. Only God defines righteousness. So if there's one takeaway I can leave you with, and I have more, don't worry, we're not done today. But if there's one takeaway I can leave you with, let that be one of them. Only God defines righteousness. As we conclude this series, I want to go back to something we talked about a few times earlier. I mentioned a few times that Judges was not laid out chronologically, but I never told you why. Now let me offer an opinion on that, because I think it's incredibly relevant to some of these key lessons. And to explain why, I'm just going to let Judges explain it itself. So bear with me. I'm going to read quite a few verses here, but these are all from chapter 2, starting from verses 10 to 19. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what they had done for Israel. Now, the first time, I'm going to read the rest of it in a minute, but the first time you read verse 10, how many of you were impacted by that? Let me ask you a different way. How many of you just kind of read it and kept going? I did. It should horrify us, because what comes next is now obvious. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who brought them up out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around the world, all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. Remember, this was all in the covenant, right? They were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. They quickly turned from the ways of their ancestors who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies, as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. This is what doing what's right in your own eyes means. It means constantly regressing further and further away from the Lord. So, why isn't Judges written in chronological order? I believe it's because the author has a thematic message that is lost on us unless he lays it out the way he did. Verse 2:10 is the key pivot point in Judges. Verses 2:10 and 21:25 explain everything that happens in the book. If you had to do a Cliff Notes in Judges, it would be those two verses. All the stuff in between is color commentary. But it's 2:10 and 21:25. I think the author wanted us, he knew he needed to build up this, I'm going to call it this horror, right? Build up the drama of these stories, because verse 2:10 by itself wasn't going to be enough. We needed a little more fill in to really make that impactful. Because if you remember, the prologue sets the stage from the human perspective and the heavenly perspective. The main body shows kind of the mechanics of how things degrade, and an encouragement of individual faith even when the community as a whole is failing to be righteous. The violence escalates. Look at the progression of how women are portrayed in Judges. Early on, they're given places of honor and heroism, and by the end of it, they're cut into 12 pieces and they're legislated rape. It's quite a serious fall there. And again, as I said, the capstone to me is verse 2:10 to 21:25. Those two verses really sum up the whole book. And that the structure that's laid out kind of, I think, reinforces the theory that, look, if we're left to our own devices, we mess it up. Bottom-up righteousness, or doing what's right in our own eyes, it doesn't work. Flat out does not work. Righteousness has to come from the Lord, It has to be top down. Another way to interpret it, as I said, is that, thematically, Judges is one giant spotlight to Christ. The darkness and starkness of humanity in a bottom-up righteousness perspective, or the darkness of humanity when we're left to our own devices, I think is such a evil contrast to the need and the solution that Christ fulfills in our lives. You could read Judges as kind of a discouragement, and there's some elements of that. But when I read it and think about it in terms of what God has done for us, and Judges sets the stage in the Old Testament for Samuel and the reign of kings, and we see how that all worked out. But that whole continuity leads to salvation in Christ Jesus, which is just amazing. Amazing beyond words. So I think the cruelty of human nature that we see in Judges, the failing of bottom-up righteousness, just points more towards the need of Jesus Christ, which even more emphasizes the amazing power of the gospel. Let me conclude with a call to action. When you leave here today, ask yourself, how can I be Othniel? How can I be Jotham? How can I boldly proclaim God's righteousness? Not my righteousness. Not CNBC righteousness or Twitter's righteousness or whatever's righteousness. How can I proclaim boldly God's righteousness? If you were here for the lesson on Shamgar, you know he's my favorite judge. A man, a few verses. I'm out plowing. What? 300 Philistines? Let me grab my ox goad. Let's go to work, God. Where's your ox goad? Be Shamgar. Use what you have. God has given you what he wants you to have to serve him. Whatever it is. Ordinary people, ordinary tools. Be Shamgar. Grab your ox goad. Be Deborah. Encourage others to success. Be that righteous voice for your spouse, for your family, for your brothers and sisters in the church, for your neighbors, for your co-workers. Be Samson. Be spiritually strong when you're weak. Remember, Samson's not about physical strength. That's just kind of a neat dynamic, and it's a neat way to tell the story. But Samson's crowning achievement was that moment of faith he finally had in his greatest weakness. I would encourage you to be obedient. Seek that which is right in the eyes of the Lord. It's in the Bible. You have to be in the Bible. Be thankful. Be thankful always. Really cling to that peace of Christ that surpasses understanding. There's a lot of stuff in this world that doesn't make sense. I think the biggest thing that makes no sense is grace. It's not fair. Grace isn't fair, and I am so thankful that it's not fair. Be loving. We could talk the rest of the year on what that means. Be loving. Pray for America. Pray for our leaders, even if you disagree with them. God put them there for his purposes, maybe not ours. God didn't ask me what political sign I put in my front yard, but I'm praying for our past leader, I'm praying for our current leader, and I'll pray for future leaders. So let me end this by asking you a question. And talk about this today at lunch. Really, please, talk about this at lunch today. Don't put it off. Is God your God? Is he your God every day? Do you serve him every day? Where's your ox goad? If I were to ask your family, is God your God, what would they say? What if I asked your neighbors? What if I asked your coworkers? What if I asked your Facebook friends? What if I asked the people you tweet with? I know I bash social media a lot, but in our actions, our thoughts, our words, our deeds, who are you serving? Are you serving your own righteousness? Or are you serving God's righteousness? Thank you all for listening. Don't miss the start of a new series next week. Let's end in a word in prayer, please.